In the last episodes, we learned how the vowels work when they are alone, but what happens when they are together? Well, today we are going to find out. To do so, we need to explain the logic behind the three linguistic phenomena that involve vowels: diphthong, triphthong, and hiatus. When we find a group of consecutive vowels, two things can happen. They either stay together as one syllable, or they split up. When a group of vowels sticks together as one syllable, the phenomenon is called a diphthong if we have a group of two consecutive vowels, and a triphthong if we have a group of three consecutive vowels. On the other hand, when a group of consecutive vowels splits up, the phenomenon is called hiatus. Now, let's see each phenomenon in detail. A diphthong, in Italian dittongo, is a group of two consecutive vowels within the same syllable, where one of the two vowels is always either an I or a U. This term comes from the ancient Greek word diphthongos, literally double sound. A diphthong occurs when a weak vowel meets another weak vowel, for example, più, ma, feather, or when a strong vowel meets a weak vowel, for example, fiore, flower. Among the possible combination of vowels that can form a diphthong, IE and UO are worth mentioning due to their exceptional characteristic. They are called dittonghi mobili, literally mobile diphthongs, to signal that they change in their derived forms, losing the I or the U. This happens in several cases. This phenomenon occurs in the conjugation of some verbs, such as venire, to come, potere, can, or volere, to want. So, for example, we'll have io vengo and tu vieni, io posso, egli poté, and tu puoi, io voglio, and tu vuoi. So the diphthong changes when it either loses the accent, for example, egli poté, or the syllable ends with a consonant, for example, io posso. In other words, to keep the diphthong, the syllable has to meet two requirements. It has to carry the accent and it has to end with a vowel. For example, tu puoi. However, be careful. Some verbs, such as muovere, to move, sometimes like to keep their diphthongs despite the rules. And I'll tell you more. There are some verbs, such as chiedere, to ask, where the diphthong is crystallized and never changes. This can happen due to etymological reasons, but there are also some cases where the diphthong needs to stay to avoid confusion. For example, the verb nuotare, to swim, never loses its diphthong, because we don't want to confuse it with the verb notare, to notice. Diphthongs also change in some cases with the so-called nomi alterati, literally altered names, a special category of names that comprehend, for example, diminutives and augmentatives. So, for example, a man is called uomo, but a big man is called omone, and an egg is called uovo, but a small egg is called ovetto. As you can see, once again, this happens because the diphthong loses the accent. At last, diphthongs change when they lose the accent in derived nouns and adjectives. For example, we'll have uomo, man, and umano, human. However, watch out for the exceptions. The diphthong does not change in some compound words. The most common exceptions are compound words that include buono, good. For example, buongiorno. Compound words that include fuori, out. For example, fuoriuscito. And adverbs that end in mente. For example, nuovamente. Now, I'd like to say that's all as far as concerns the diphthongs. However, I need to add one more thing. There are groups of vowels that seem like diphthongs, but they are not. These exceptions are cha, cho, chu. For example, ka, mi, cha, shirt, ba, cho, kiss, and ciuffo, tuft. Già, gio, giù. For example, giacca, jacket, gioco, game, and giusto, right. Glia, glie, glio. For example, famiglia, family, famiglie, families, and coniglio, rabbit. Scia, scio, sciù. For example, sciarpa, scarf, sciocco, silly, and asciutto, dry. In all these cases, the diphthongs are fake because the only purpose of the E is to make the sound soft. Nevertheless, just like diphthongs, they make a syllable and cannot be divided. This rule applies also to triphthongs. Speaking of which, a triphthong, in Italian TRITTONGO, is a group of 3 consecutive vowels within the same syllable. It occurs when a strong vowel, A, E, and O, usually bearing an accent, meets 2 weak vowels, I and U. So, for example, we'll have words like miei, guai, puoi, or aiuola. This term comes from the ancient Greek word triphthongos, literally triple sound. And finally, last but not least, the hiatus. The hiatus, in Italian Ïato, from the Latin hiatus, opening, is a group of consecutive vowels pronounced separately belonging to 2 different syllables. A hiatus occurs when we have a group of strong vowels, A, E, and O. For example, teatro, theater, or aereo, airplane. When A, E, or O meet I or U, but they carry the accent. For example, via, street, or paura, fear. It's important to keep in mind that the hiatus stays even in the derived words, even if the I and U lose their accent. For example, viale, avenue, or pauroso, scary. When a prefix is added to the word starting with a vowel, for example, riunire, to bring together, biennale, biennial, triangolo, triangle, antiacido, or due to etymological reasons, for example, innocuo, or vacuo, due to their Latin etymology. In conclusion, while rules are important, it's good to remember that Italian is full of exceptions. Thus, do not hesitate to check out multiple sources when in doubt. And that's everything I had to say as far as concerns Italian vowels, this time for real. If you have any more doubts, let me know in the comments. If you need more examples or clarifications, I'll be happy to make some shorts or leave some notes in the comment section. Grazie for watching and
Arrivederci.